He thought he had everything: power, wealth, control, until a little girl with a broken bracelet walked into his life and shattered the walls around his heart. But when the truth of her identity was revealed, his empire wasn't the only thing at stake. His soul was. The night sky hung heavy with dark clouds, and the city seemed swallowed by a storm that poured relentlessly, washing the streets with sheets of rain that pounded against glass windows, rooftops, and the endless stream of umbrellas carried by people rushing to escape the chill, their hurried footsteps echoing against the pavement, their eyes fixed only on reaching somewhere dry and safe, too consumed by their own lives to notice anything else. Yet in the midst of this chaos, a sleek black limousine rolled to a smooth stop outside a towering building, its polished frame gleaming under the fractured glow of neon signs blurred by raindrops, and from within emerged Ethan Cole, a man whose name stirred awe and fear in boardrooms across the country, a man whose sharp blue tailored suit clung to him with authority, whose piercing blue eyes usually scanned the world with cold calculation, and whose reputation as a ruthless 30-year-old millionaire CEO preceded him wherever he went. But tonight, as his driver held an umbrella above him, shielding him from the storm, Ethan walked with his usual briskness, his mind preoccupied with deals, contracts, and deadlines, the usual noise of power and money that drowned any chance of human warmth, until suddenly, like a sharp cord cutting through a silent room, his gaze caught something that stopped him dead in his tracks. Something so small and fragile that for a moment he doubted if it were real. But it was real. There, only a few steps away from the crowded sidewalk, sat a little girl, no older than 6, her body curled tightly against the cold stone wall as though trying to make herself disappear. Her golden hair plastered across her tear-streaked cheeks by the rain, her delicate sharp pink frock soaked through and clinging miserably to her shivering form, her tiny bare hands wrapped around her knees in a futile attempt to keep war. And though hundreds of rushing feet passed her, though voices rose and fell around her, though taxi horns blared and thunder growled above, no one stopped, no one looked, no one cared. She was invisible to the world, yet somehow painfully visible to him, and Ethan, who had always told himself that emotions were weakness, who had always measured worth in profit and loss, felt something crack within him, a deep ache that he had long buried, memories of emptiness he never shared, shadows of nights where even success could not buy him peace. And without realizing, his polished shoes slowed against the wet ground, splashing through puddles as his driver frowned in confusion, calling out to him, but Ethan ignored everything, his focus locked on the girl as though drawn by an invisible thread, and each step closer brought a surge of questions. Why was she alone? Where was her family? How long had she been sitting there under this merciless storm? But more than questions, there was a pull, a need to bridge the distance between his world of wealth and her world of abandonment, until finally he stood before her, rain dripping down his jaw, his expensive suit soaking through because he had stepped out from beneath the umbrella without caring, and as he gazed down at her small figure trembling against the stone, he felt his breath catch, and in that moment she slowly lifted her head, her big blue eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Eyes that mirrored the storm raging above them yet somehow pierced straight through the icy armor he had worn for years, and for the first time Ethan Cole, the untouchable CEO, was not thinking about mergers, not about money, not about the empire he had built. He was simply a man staring at a broken child in the rain, and when her lips parted, but only a fragile sob escaped, muffled as though she had learned already that crying Glee would bring no help, Ethan felt his throat tighten, his heart hammering in ways it hadn't since his own childhood, and against every rule he had lived by. Against the cold nature he wore like a shield, he slowly bent down on one knee, uncaring that the concrete soaked his trousers, uncaring that the storm raged harder, uncaring about the stares of passers-by who now paused to watch this unusual sight, and in a voice softer than he thought himself capable of, a voice that carried both command and compassion, he leaned close enough so she could hear him over the thunder and whispered, "Why are you alone?" The words lingered in the storm like a fragile thread of hope. "Why are you alone?" And the silence that followed seemed louder than the thunder above, until the little girl finally raised her head, her trembling lips parting to release a voice so small, so fragile, it could have been mistaken for the rain itself. I don't have anywhere to go." And those words pierced Ethan deeper than he expected, slicing through his carefully built walls, and in that moment, the mighty CEO who commanded skyscrapers and empires suddenly felt powerless before a child's truth, his eyes narrowing not in coldness but in a silent struggle as he wrestled with emotions he had locked away for years, for he was a man who knew how to buy companies, to crush rivals, to multiply wealth, but he had never known how to soothe tears, never known how to bridge the gap between power and pain. Yet as he looked at her small frame shaking beneath the merciless rain, he felt something inside him break free, a forgotten instinct that whispered he could not leave her like this. And so, with a hesitant breath, Ethan shrugged off his tailored coat, the one that symbolized his power and prestige, the one that had never touched the ground or the dirt of ordinary lives, and he knelt again, lifting it with steady hands to drape it around her shoulders, his heart tightening as he watched the heavy fabric swallow her tiny figure, the coat so large on her it nearly brushed the wet ground, yet instantly it shielded her from the storm, and for the first time that night she flinched not from the cold but from surprise, her wide blue eyes searching his face with confusion, as though she couldn't comprehend why a man so polished, so untouchable, would stop for someone like her, and Ethan, who had not felt warmth in years beyond the shallow praise of shareholders, suddenly felt the flicker of something human, something painfully real, stir inside his chest, and as the rain continued to fall around them, as taxis hissed past and strangers paused to watch, the CEO who had once prided himself on never bowing to sentiment, felt an unfamiliar heat burn in his eyes, an ache that reminded him he was more than just a machine built to make money, and though he wanted to speak, wanted to tell her she was safe now, his throat caught with words unsaid, so instead he simply tightened the coat around her small body, his hands lingering for a moment on her thin shoulders, as if silently promising her she would not be invisible tonight. And in that fragile gesture something monumental shifted inside him, a quiet revelation that no deal, no signature, no empire had ever given him, the feeling of being human again, the feeling of being needed, the feeling of seeing his power not in contracts, but in the ability to shield a child from the storm. And as she leaned ever so slightly into the coat, her shivering slowing though her tears still fell, Ethan realized with a jolt that this small act, this single moment of kindness in the rain, was unraveling a part of him he thought had died long ago. The ride from the rain-soaked street to the towering gates of Ethan Cole's mansion felt like crossing two worlds, the limousine gliding through puddled avenues while the little girl sat curled in silence beneath his oversized coat, her tiny hands clutching the fabric as if it were a lifeline, her damp golden hair clinging to her cheeks, and Ethan, usually lost in thoughts of profits and deadlines, found himself watching her reflection in the window, wondering how many nights she had sat alone like that without anyone noticing, and when the car stopped before the sprawling estate, its grand pillars lit like ivory under soft lamps. His staff rushed forward, prepared to greet their master with the usual rehearsed precision, but their steps faltered when they saw the small figure trailing behind him, a child whose fragile presence looked almost unreal in the grandeur of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and whispers darted among them. Who was she? Why was she here? Had their employer lost his mind? But Ethan ignored the murmurs, leading Lily into the warmth of the mansion where the storm became only a faint whisper against the tall windows, and soon a steaming bowl of soup was placed before her on the long dining table, though the vastness of the room made her appear even smaller, her hands trembling as she lifted the spoon, her wide eyes darting around as if unsure she was allowed to eat, and Ethan sat opposite, leaning forward, his piercing gaze softened not by power, but by a strange concern he could not disguise, and as the warmth of the food loosened the stiffness in her, words began to stumble from her lips, halting, hesitant, yet heavy with truth. How her parents had been taken in an accident, how she had been placed in a foster home where harsh voices replaced tender ones, where she was treated not as a child, but as a burden, and how one night, gathering every ounce of courage her little body could hold, she had slipped out into the unknown, choosing the cruelty of the streets over the cruelty of that house, her voice trembling as she admitted she had nowhere left to go, and with each sentence Ethan's jaw clenched tighter, his fingers curling against the table as if to steady the storm rising inside him, for he had seen ruthless sides of humanity in business, had watched grown men lie and betray for power, hearing such darkness woven into the story of a child, carved wounds deeper than any corporate battle ever had, and he felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest, a mixture of rage toward the faceless system that had failed her, and a fierce, protective instinct he had never known he carried. And though he had built his empire on control, tonight he felt utterly unprepared. For how could he negotiate with grief? How could he outbid loneliness? How could he undo the years of pain etched into her young eyes? Yet as her voice broke and she lowered her gaze, ashamed of burdens that were never hers to bear, Ethan realized that perhaps he didn't need answers tonight. Perhaps the first step was simply being the one person who finally listened, and so he remained silent. Not the silence of indifference, but the silence of a man shattered by truth, his cold exterior crumbling in ways even he couldn't explain. And in that silence, he vowed quietly to himself that this little girl would never again feel invisible under the rain, that the world might have stripped her of family, but it would not strip her of hope, not while he was here. That night, silence wrapped around the mansion like a heavy cloak, broken only by the distant patter of rain dripping from the eaves, and Ethan, restless and unable to sleep, wandered through the long corridor with his thoughts tangled in a storm fiercer than the one outside, his steps slow, his mind replaying the fragile way Lily had clutched his coat earlier as though it were the only shield she had against the world. And though he told himself he had brought her into his home simply out of duty, the truth was far more complicated, for something in her innocence had stirred a part of his heart he had buried long ago. And as he paused outside the softly lit guest room where she lay, he hesitated, fighting an urge he could not name. Then finally Ave in and quietly pushed the door open, his sharp blue eyes softening the instant they landed on the small figure curled up beneath the oversized blankets, her breathing slow and steady, her golden hair spilling across the pillow like threads of sunlight even in the dim light. And as he stepped closer, he noticed her tiny hand resting on top of the covers, delicate and unmoving, and around that wrist gleamed something that caught the faint glow of the lamp. A simple silver bracelet, small enough to be overlooked yet powerful enough to stop Ethan in his tracks, for when he leaned down and his eyes fell upon the initials carved into the metal, his entire body froze, his breath catching sharply in his throat, the letters CH staring back at him like ghosts resurrected from the past. And for a moment he swayed where he stood, his heart pounding as if it were trying to escape his chest, because those two letters were not random. They belonged to a name he had never forgotten, a name etched deep into the marrow of his being, Clara Hayes, the woman who had once been the center of his world, the woman whose laughter had once filled the void in his life with light, the woman who had vanished years ago without explanation, leaving behind nothing but questions and an emptiness that no wealth or success had ever managed to fill. And now, impossibly, her initials were here, on the wrist of a child he had met by chance on a rain-soaked night, and Ethan's hands trembled as he reached out instinctively, though he stopped himself just inches away from touching the bracelet, his mind screaming with a dozen unanswered questions. Could this girl somehow be connected to Clara? Could this fragile little soul with wide blue eyes carry within her the echo of the woman he had once loved? And as he stood there in the hush of the room, curiosity and fear coiled inside him like snakes battling for dominance, one urging him to search for the truth at any cost, the other whispering that the truth might break him more than the lies ever had. And though the rational part of him tried to dismiss it as coincidence, the hollow ache in his chest refused to be silenced, for nothing about Lily had felt like coincidence from the moment he saw her drenched on that street, and he remembered the way her eyes had pierced him, innocent yet strangely familiar, stirring something that felt dangerously close to recognition, and now with the initials gleaming softly against her skin, the familiarity was undeniable, and Ethan backed away slowly, his jaw tightening as if bracing against a storm that was not made of wind or rain, but of memories he had spent years burying. Yet no matter how far he tried to step, his gaze kept returning to that bracelet, to the haunting letters, to the mystery they carried, and he realized with a sinking weight that his life, so carefully constructed and controlled, was about to unravel, and it would not be a hostile takeover, nor a corporate scandal that undid him, but the tiny bracelet on the wrist of a child asleep in his bed. And though he left the room without waking her, retreating into the darkness of the corridor, he carried the image with him like a brand on his heart, every step echoing with questions too heavy to answer, for the ruthless CEO who had built empires and crushed rivals now found himself trembling before the possibility that fate had returned Clara Hayes to him, not in the way he expected, but in the form of a secret waiting to be uncovered. And as he finally reached his room and sat heavily on the edge of his bed, running a hand through his black hair with a groan, he realized that sleep would never come to him that night, not with the storm raging inside, not with those initials burning in his mind, not with the gnawing fear that the child under his roof was not just a stranger needing shelter, but the key to a truth he both longed for and dreaded with every fiber of his being. Days passed like soft wispy whirs across the edges of Ethan's once rigid life, and where there had only been the sound of ticking clocks, the hum of business calls, and the hollow echo of his own footsteps on marble floors, there was now laughter spilling through the hallways, the light patter of small shoes racing across expensive rugs, and the unmistakable warmth of life that clung to every corner of his mansion. Yet despite the joy Lily brought into his world, a heaviness gnawed at him, a restlessness rooted not in the present, but in the delicate piece of jewelry wrapped around her tiny wrist, a bracelet etched with the letters CH, a silent reminder of a woman he once loved so fiercely that her disappearance had carved a permanent scar into his chest. A woman named Clara Hayes, whose name he hadn't spoken aloud in years, and as Ethan drove Lily to school each morning, hearing her chatter about her drawings, about the classmate who shared her crayons, about the way the sky looked different every day, he felt himself smiling in ways he hadn't known he could. And yet, when his gaze fell on that bracelet as it glistened in the sunlight, his stomach twisted, and questions clawed their way to the surface of his mind like restless ghosts demanding to be heard, until finally, one sleepless night, unable to bear the storm inside him, he picked up the phone and hired a private investigator, instructing him to dig deep into Lily's past, her records, her guardians, her origins, anything that could unravel the mystery of the initials that haunted him. And though he masked his urgency with calm words, his pulse betrayed him, racing at the thought that the answer could either restore something he had lost, or destroy the fragile peace he was beginning to build. Days stretched into weeks, and while the investigator worked in the shadows, Ethan's world blossomed with quiet changes. He found himself waiting outside the school gates earlier than necessary, scanning the crowd for Lily's familiar smile, feeling something surge inside him whenever she spotted him and ran into his arms as though he were her only safe place. And when she asked him one evening why he never smiled in the portraits hanging in his home, portraits of a younger man with sharper eyes and a sterner jaw, Ethan didn't know how to explain that those paintings were of someone he no longer wished to be, someone hardened by loss, blinded by ambition, and locked away from the tender light she now carried into his life so effortlessly. And when she giggled after sneaking into his office and pretending to sit at his chair, declaring herself the boss, Ethan laughed so hard tears filled his eyes, startling him because it had been years since his body had remembered how to cry from joy. Yet behind every smile, every gentle moment, the shadow of the bracelet lingered, whispering of connections and truths, waiting to be unveiled, and he could not silence the gnawing fear that Clara, his Clara, might be tied to this little girl in ways he was not ready to accept, for if she was, then he would have to face not just Lily's past, but his own. The choices he made, the silence he allowed, the love he lost, the life he could have had. And in those moments of solitude, when Lily was fast asleep and the night stretched endlessly before him, Ethan found himself staring at her bracelet, at the initials that glimmered faintly under the lamp, feeling as though the universe was circling him back to a chapter he had tried so hard to close, a chapter that perhaps was never truly finished. And though his rational mind fought against the impossible, his heart whispered louder with each day that Clara's spirit lived on in this child, whether by blood, by fate, or by some unexplainable thread that bound them together. And as he sat one evening by the fire, Lily curled up beside him with her head resting on his arm, Ethan realized something profound, that the man he had been, cold and driven by nothing but wealth, would never I've noticed her bracelet, would never have cared about her laughter, would never have thought twice about school drop-offs or silly drawings, but the man he was becoming, reshaped by a child who carried both innocence and mystery, could no longer imagine a world without her. And it terrified him, for love in all its forms demanded vulnerability, demanded risk, demanded a heart willing to break, and his heart, though scarred and reluctant, was beginning to beat differently, softer, fuller, freer, and as the fire crackled and the night deepened, Ethan knew one thing with certainty: whatever truth the investigator uncovered, whether it tied Lily to Clara or not, whether it shattered him or saved him, he was already bound to this little girl forever, for she had not only brought life back into his house, but had begun to mend the man who lived inside it. And though he did not yet know if he was ready to face the truth of the bracelet, he did know this: his heart had already begun to change, and there was no going back. Ethan's hand trembled as he held the investigator's report, his sharp blue eyes blurring with tears that refused to be contained, and though he was a man who had once conquered the coldest boardrooms and stared down merciless deals without flinching, nothing had ever broken him like the revelation that the fragile child who had stumbled into his life with nothing but pain in her eyes was, in truth, the very blood he thought he had lost forever, the living echo of the woman he had loved with every corner of his soul. Clara Hayes, the woman whose laughter had once softened his darkest nights and whose sudden disappearance had left him hollow, was gone, but her spirit lived on in Lily, the little girl who carried her eyes, her gentleness, her resilience. And now Ethan felt time itself collapse as he dropped to his knees, clutching the report against his chest, unable to decide if he should weep for the years he had lost or rejoice for the miracle he had been given. He rose slowly, unsteady as if the ground itself had shifted, and walked toward Lily's room, where she slept soundly, her small hand curled against the pillow, the bracelet with those haunting initials glinting faintly in the moonlight, and he sat by her bedside, whispering broken words. "You're mine. My daughter. Clara's gift." His voice cracking as if the universe had finally allowed him to breathe after years of suffocation. And he vowed in that moment that he would never let her feel alone again, that he would shield her from every cruelty the world had hurled at her, that he would give her every dream, every joy, every ounce of love he had buried. When morning came, Lily's bright eyes blinked open to find him there, and Ethan, with tears unhidden, whispered the truth, hesitant, fearful, yet needing her to know, and her little face froze, confusion and disbelief swirling before tears welled in her eyes as she whispered back in a trembling voice, "You're my dad?" And when he nodded, she broke into sobs that shook her small frame, throwing herself into his arms with such force that his heart nearly burst, for in that embrace he felt Clara again, and for the first time in years he felt whole. And though sorrow lingered like a shadow for all the lost years, hope blazed brighter, because they had found each other, because fate had not been cruel enough to keep them apart forever. In the days that followed, Ethan introduced Lily not as a child he had taken in, but as his daughter, stunning everyone who had known him as a man too hardened for love, and he didn't care about the whispers or the shock. All that mattered was the laughter that now rang through his mansion, the small hand that reached for his in crowds, the voice that called him daddy, with a trust so pure it healed wounds he thought eternal. He visited Clara's grave with Lily, kneeling beside her, his arm wrapped around his daughter as they placed flowers gently on the cold stone, and he spoke soft, lie to the woman he had lost. "I've found her, Clara. I'll protect her for you, for us." And Lily, wiping her tears, whispered, "Mom, we're together now." And the wind seemed to carry Clara's spirit in that moment, wrapping them both in warmth. Ethan's empire no longer defined him. Fatherhood did, love did, Lily did. And as they walked away hand in hand, the world around them seemed less sharp, less ruthless, as though life itself had chosen to give him a second chance. And with every sunrise that painted the sky, Ethan promised silently that he would never waste another moment, for he had discovered the truth too precious to ignore. The little girl he had once saved had saved him in return, and together, father and daughter, they stepped into a future where loneliness no longer ruled, where love had the final word, and where Clara's memory lived on not as loss, but as the bond that tied their hearts forever. The news spread like wildfire across the city, shaking boardrooms, gossip columns, and social circles alike, because everyone who had once known Ethan Montgomery as the cold, heartless CEO, who measured life only in profits and power, now found it impossible to reconcile that image with the man who was suddenly walking into charity events, hand in hand with a little girl, who was seen dropping her off at school, with a smile rather than a stern command, and who openly declared to his closest associates that his empire could crumble tomorrow, and he would not care as long as Lily was safe beside him. And though the whispers and laughter were sharp, mockery from rivals who saw weakness, judgment from investors who feared risk, and cruel speculation from journalists who painted him as a man gone soft, the truth was that Ethan, for the first time in his life, was unshaken by the world's opinions, because the hollow walls of his mansion no longer echoed with loneliness, but with laughter, with small footsteps pattering down hallways, with innocent questions that made him think about life in ways no corporate deal ever had, and the enemies plotted to exploit his supposed vulnerability, offering bribes, striking dangerous alliances, and even spreading rumors that Lily was not truly his. Ethan stood taller than ever, telling them with steady eyes, "This girl is my daughter, she is my blood, she is my life, and if you think I will trade her for numbers on a ledger, then you never knew who I was at all." And his voice carried not the weight of money, but the force of love, which made even his staunchest critics fall silent. For what weapon could truly pierce a man who had finally found the one thing worth protecting? Yet the test of love was not only in public declarations but in private trials, because some nights, Ethan lay awake haunted by guilt that he had once let Clara slip through his hands, guilt that Lily had grown up without knowing her father's embrace, guilt that he had spent years chasing illusions while his true treasure waited in shadows. But every time Lily stirred in her sleep and her tiny hand reached for his, those doubts melted, and he whispered promises into the darkness, that this time he would not fail, this time he would not run, this time he would not let love slip away again, and in keeping those promises he began to transform not only himself, but everyone around him, for the employees who once feared his cold commands now saw a gentler leader, who built schools in Clara's name, who funded orphanages where children like Lily could find safety, and who gave second chances to broken families, saying softly that profit meant nothing if humanity was lost. And slowly the world that had doubted him began to shift, investors realizing that compassion created loyalty, rivals stunned that his strength grew rather than faded, the media moved to tears by the story of a ruthless billionaire who discovered his heart through a child's bracelet, and though Ethan never sought applause, he found himself being hailed not as a mogul, but as a father. And that was the only title he cherished, because when Lily looked up at him with trust shining in her eyes and called him Daddy, without hesitation, he felt richer than every dollar in his empire combined. And so as the seasons turned and life settled into a rhythm, Ethan and Lily would sit by Clara's grave holding hands, telling her stories, thanking her for the love she had left behind, and Ethan would vow aloud, "I lost you once, Clara, but I will never lose the gift you gave me. For in Lily I found not only my daughter but my redemption, and no deal, no company, no power will ever come before her again." And in that moment, with the wind whispering through the trees and Lily's head resting gently against his shoulder, Ethan Montgomery, the man the world had once feared, understood at last that the truest wealth was not in skyscrapers or bank accounts, but in the fragile, unbreakable bond of love, a love that had tested him, broken him, remade him, and finally given him something worth living and fighting for, until his very last breath. On a bright morning, the mansion that once stood as a symbol of loneliness now carried the warmth of laughter as sunlight streamed through its tall glass windows, and in the grand hall, Ethan, the man once known only for his ruthless empire, knelt before Lily, his trembling hands clutching the delicate bracelet that had haunted his nights, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Your mother was the only woman I ever loved, and you, Lily, are the greatest gift she left me, a treasure I didn't know I had been missing. But now that I've found you, I promise I will never let you cry in the rain again, never let you stand alone in this world, never let you feel unwanted again." Lily's small hands clung to him with desperate strength, tears streaming down her cheeks as her fragile voice shook. "I always prayed for a father, and now God gave me you." And in that moment Ethan's heart, once encased in stone, shattered into 1,000 pieces of tenderness, no longer a fortress, but a home, beating only for this child who had turned his life upside down. And as he wrapped his arms around her tiny frame, he felt more alive than he ever had at the peak of his business victories. The staff of the mansion stood quietly in the background, some wiping their own tears, unable to believe the sight of the once cold CEO transformed into a man whose entire being was now bent in devotion to a little girl, and the world outside may have still whispered, mocked, or judged. But within those walls there was only the sacred bond of father and daughter that no voice of greed or power could break. Days passed and Ethan no longer hurried to boardrooms or corporate battles at dawn. Instead, he hurried to braid Lily's hair clumsily, to pack her school bag, to drive her through the city while she sang songs in the passenger seat, her laughter filling spaces where silence once ruled, and every giggle reminded him more than any profit sheet that he had finally discovered the true meaning of wealth. Lily too began to blossom under his love, her once guarded eyes now bright with confidence, her smiles no longer fleeting but deep and unrestrained, and she would hold his hand tightly at night as if afraid he might vanish like a dream, whispering in her sleep, "Don't leave me, Daddy." Words that pierced him and renewed his vow to never let go again. Ethan, once defined by titles, power, and ruthless ambition, now found joy in reading bedtime stories until he fell asleep beside her, in attending school events and cheering the loudest in the audience, in sketching plans for a future not of mergers and acquisitions but of birthdays, graduations, and the long road of fatherhood that stretched before him, beautiful in its simplicity. There were moments of challenge, of course, whispers from investors that he had softened, articles questioning his judgment, competitors circling like vultures sensing weakness, but Ethan stood firm, his voice echoing with unshakable strength as he declared publicly, "This girl is my daughter. She is my life, and no deal, no company, no empire will ever come before her again." And those who once mocked him now saw a man who had discovered a love greater than fear, a purpose stronger than greed. On quiet nights, he would sit by Lily's bed, the bracelet glinting faintly in the lamplight, and he would speak softly as if to Clara, his lost love, telling her, "I found her, Clara. I found the piece of you I thought was gone forever, and I promise I'll protect her with every breath left in me." And though no answer came, he felt a peace in his soul, as though Clara herself smiled through the little girl's eyes. Lily would sometimes trace his face with her small fingers and whisper, "You're not scary anymore." And Ethan would chuckle with tears in his eyes, realizing that this child had healed him in ways he never thought possible, making him not just a better man, but finally a complete human being. The mansion that once echoed only with footsteps now echoed with piano practice, giggles, and the sound of two voices singing off-key in the kitchen while making pancakes, a picture of imperfection that was perfect in every way that mattered. Ethan no longer saw himself as a CEO first, but as a father who happened to run a company, and though the world might one day test him again, he knew he had already passed the only test that mattered, the test of love. On one golden morning, as Lily skipped into his arms in the garden, her hair catching the light, Ethan lifted her high and she laughed, shouting, "I love you, Daddy!" And in that instant the cold, ruthless millionaire of yesterday was gone forever, replaced by a father whose greatest empire was not built in boardrooms, but in the heart of a little girl who had finally found her home. The crowd once whispered about Ethan Cole's ruthless empire, but now, they whispered about something greater, how a little girl in the Ray and transformed a millionaire's heart, giving him the only fortune that truly mattered, love, care, and family.